You're considering a lot of learning styles. The
Yeah.
public spaces, that's required, but it's under different provisions in the sense that your child is, in some cases, they're sought out, they're identified, a structure and plan is set up with the parent included, a whole way of, making some decisions about what that plan is going to entail and how it will be implemented. In the higher education space, you have to self-disclose.
Hello, and welcome to the Black and Dyslexic Podcast with Winifred A. Winston and LaDerrick Horn, the show that unapologetically focuses on helping Black and underrepresented minorities navigate the special education process. We want to help raise awareness in the Black and Brown community, remove the stigma about learning disabilities, and provide you access to professionals in the space of dyslexia and special education that you need to hear from. Today, we're going to be talking about accommodations in college and the workplace. I have with me Dr. Allison Butler. She is the Director of Accessibility Services, and she's also the ADA Compliance Officer in Higher Education. And I'm not going to be coy about it. I know Allison. We worked together about 6 years ago. I was Associate Director of Career Services, and she was the Director of Accessibility Services. So she's been doing this work for a long time. So I am so excited to have you, Allison. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Winifred. I'm so happy and just overjoyed with everything that you've been doing in this work. We really need your voice, and I'm just glad that I could partner in this way.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And also, Allison is on our Business Development Committee for Dyslexia Advocation. So we are made up of good stock in this space because there is a lot of work that needs to be done. So Allison, tell me, what do you do? And just give us a little snippet of accessibility services and the work around ADA compliance before we dig deep, so the audience will understand how important and what this work means to folks who have learning disabilities.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Overall, in my role, I manage like the daily functions and activities around providing accommodations in like the different spaces around campus. So for instance, if we're thinking about the classroom, there's specific academic accommodations. If there's housing involved, there's specific housing needs. If we're thinking about library, there's certain things that, the library has to consider in navigating accessibility to all. And we also provide accommodations in the workplace as well for employees. So we're a federally mandated office. So ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. And Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And what that means is that any institution that receives any federal dollars has to provide services to ensure inclusion of anyone with a disability. So our offices exist at every college in the United States. So know that there's some form or representation, depending on the size of the institution. You'll see larger offices. At smaller institutions, I've seen a one-person shop. So it's going to look a lot different. Also, the way that accommodations are managed and implemented really depends on how the institution is set up. And leadership really factors into that, having support and the funds to, make sure that you're staying on par with like best practices. There's a professional association that we join, which is called AHEAD. That's the Association for Higher Education and Disability. And that really is a forum for us they have conferences, they host webinars, we talk through this work. There's regional boards that actually engage in professional development around this work. And so it's an active process in making sure that we are staying up to par with what is considered best for inclusion, access, and equity.
Wow, and you just dropped a lot. I just want to chime in because when you said ADA in 1990, I'm like, wait a minute, that wasn't very long ago because I was in high school. I was like 1990. And then I want to make it clear, You just said every college or university, every institution that receives federal dollars has some form, some type of services. So I want you guys to hear that. I want parents to hear that. So every college and university that receives federal dollars, they must provide reasonable accommodations. Right. So I want parents to hear that. And when you said that professional organization, you said AHED. Is that AHED?
EAD.
EAD.
Association for Higher Education and Disability.
Okay.
But that's the professional organization our offices, a lot of them belong to, hold professional membership, and it gives us access to a lot of different forms of engagement with nationally. Like there's a lot of institutions that are doing a lot of great work in the area of inclusion expansively, because a lot of times when we think about disability, it's like the last thing that we're considering as like identity space when we think about diversity efforts.
Sure, absolutely. Can you talk a little more about, I always reference the K&W guide to colleges for students with learning differences. And so I always tell parents there are 3 types of services. You've got your structured programs, which are the most comprehensive. And I believe you have to sign a contract. It's probably more like a program, right? And then we have coordinated services where there's at least one staff member or someone certified, and you have to voluntarily request opt-in, you know. And then we have services, schools that just provide services, which is the least comprehensive. Can you talk about the difference in those programs and what that might look like?
Yes. So some institutions actually receive endowment funds, scholarship funds, certain things that are designated to specific disability efforts. And so, for instance, some universities may have like a learning disorders clinic specifically on campus. Sometimes sometimes departments of psychology might have a specific unit that manages psychoeducational assessments, and that's they work with supervised clinical rotation for like their doctoral students. Some institutes, so those are like some of the types of structured types of services. And that's the reason why they exist. Like our offices, we have specific operational funding from the university. So whatever budgets and things like that. But sometimes it's like endowments, specific interests of like a leadership group, a leadership at that time, and focusing on a specific trend that they're seeing. Or University of Washington's a great example. So they actually have the Disabilities Opportunities, Networking, and Technology. And they provide a lot of resources for educators, students. They also, it's based under, University of Washington, but they also have a lot of public scope, and they do a lot of work, in representing best practices in like these specific areas as it relates to higher education.
Oh, that is awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. So that's an example of what a structured program might look like at a university, because essentially they're using their internal workings because of the programs that they offer. And then you may have, like you said, these endowments or funds that, or scholarship funds that are specific to a particular area, because more than likely someone had it and they have the money.
Right.
And want to say,
and they may have a student that graduated and utilized specific services. So, that's like a gift to the institution.
Sure.
And so like sometimes you'll see like a lot of universities have centers for autism, like I said earlier, learning disorders, like specialists. Some universities have an academic support centers that are available for all. And that's a really good approach as well. Some actually have specific academic coaching that is, sometimes it's tailored to all, or it's tailored to specific learning disabilities.
Okay.
So those are all things that, factor into good decisions for, the best fit for any child.
Yeah, I think we even talked about the 30 best colleges for students with learning differences.
Absolutely.
That's a resource, and we'll definitely have that in the show notes so parents can check that out. And then talk about, because I know when we worked together, we worked at a university that was online. And like I said, this was like 6-7 years ago, right? And now look how relevant that is post-pandemic. I can't even say post-pandemic, because you know what? I still have a lot of anxiety about going out in the streets.
I know. I'm very slow with it.
I am, and being around people, you know?
Right.
But I watch my daughter, she is 11. I watch her during this pandemic, her school sent her home to do virtual. And then they went back in person. But now I look at her get on Zoom, and she's 11. And I look at her, oh, mommy, I just pulled the arrow down and the number was already there. And, you know, and the other day she clicked, but she was moving too fast because she wanted to use the speech to text to look up something.
Right.
I was just watching, like, look at her go. Like, she just was getting it.
Yeah.
You know, and so talk about some of the accommodations for online learning, because that is huge right now. We know that a lot of folks have been successful with it, but a lot have not. But I don't think parents really know what help to ask for. Because this is really new territory now.
Right. The thing that's interesting, like you even mentioned, the technology space really creates so many opportunities for access, and then it creates barriers for others. And so it shifts, you know, outside of like the traditional classroom, depending on how classes are set up. I think the one thing I do appreciate at the institution that we worked for was that they actually had instructional designers that still exist. You know, they're still in place today. And so they sometimes, like, institutions really need to make decisions about who has ownership of accessibility in their wheelhouse. So for instance, for faculty at a higher ed institution, they're not trained in like special education or like in a lot of things in teacher education. Sometimes they're talking about inclusive design, universal design, because in the public school spaces, you have to ensure that like you are you're setting up your classroom and considering usability as it exists. You're considering a lot of learning styles. The public spaces, that's required, but it's under different provisions in the sense that your child is, in some cases, they're sought out, they're identified, a structure and plan is set up with the parent included, a whole way of, you know, making some decisions about what that plan is going to entail and how it will be implemented. In the higher education space, you have to self-disclose, just sharing some of the things that, you know, you've been able to learn. You have to self-identify. But the great thing is, like in the online settings, is that they have, depending on how the programs are set up. So for instance, the institution that we work for, they didn't have timed exams by the time I started there. They removed that as part of their curriculum. They found that it wasn't necessarily important to grasp, you know, an understanding of the material, to be able to show and demonstrate, you know, the learning, you know, in that type of environment. And plus they serve, you know, a lot of non-traditional students. So, you know, and part of that understanding, they're thinking ahead, you know, in some ways about removing a barrier, even though, you know, it serves individuals with disabilities, but it serves all.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Allison, that's so huge, the time exam, because, I'm always revealing that I only recently found out that I have ADHD. And I follow some folks on Instagram, and they make these jokes about ADHD. And so one of the jokes recently was, here's the ADHD brain when you have a timed exam, right? And so you're like, oh, wow, I have 1 hour. Oh, my gosh, I'm going to have 1 hour to take this exam. Oh, my gosh. And I'm reading the question, and it was making a joke. And it was like, and now I've wasted 2 minutes, because your anxiety is just so high, right? And because you're like, oh my God. And people don't understand that ADHD brain, that's what it's thinking about. I have all this time, and then all this anxiety. And it was so profound, because I had just taken the state exam, a state exam recently to earn licensure. And that was me. And I took my medicine that day. But when I sat down and I saw that timer, it's like it automatically did something to my brain. And I was like, okay, don't focus on the time. But I was focused on the time, and I wasted like 3 minutes because I was focused on the time.
And that's why exam accommodations exist. And it's unfortunate because you never got a chance to, identify, because you didn't know.
No.
And so that's what's unfortunate, because when we do extended time as an accommodation, those are the reasons for that. So there's a lot of different reasons it's needed, depending on the nature of the disability, but specifically for ADHD, like if you had time and a half, at least you have an hour to complete the exam, but you still have like another 30 minutes to deal with what you have to compensate for, that your peers don't. They don't have that same experience. So, an hour they're able to, get it done. They don't have to go through that anxiety and, that pressure, that happens. So anyway, that's a great example of why exam accommodations exist. But all online institutions don't do that. That is like a strategic move, for, a programmatic decision, but there's a lot of reasons that timed exams exist, and depending on the type of programs, because depending on the, at online institutions, not every program can be done online. You can't get your medical degree online.
No.
There's just absolutely no way. So certain programs, you're able to, a lot of times they might have open enrollment, so you don't have to go through like a specific standardized test to get in. So that's another reason some students with disabilities might find that to be a better environment for them. Some students that are really good at self-pacing themselves, they will thrive in that type of environment. Our non-traditional students, like in any type of form, whether you're a military veteran, whether you're a single mother, whether, you're working, multiple jobs, sometimes the online spaces are better. And there are accommodations there, but it really depends on how the courses are set up. So for instance, flexibility with deadlines is something that's requested depending on the, if it's a reasonable fit. And the challenge with that is that there does become a time where you can't, continue to extend a deadline. And so there's certain things like, if you negotiate like a day or two, that's one thing. But if you try to go beyond like maybe, I don't know, 5 or 7 days, there's other things that might need to be discussed because you're automatically put behind, and then it's just going to increase the anxiety and trigger a lot of things, because some individuals with chronic health conditions might need that. Sometimes some students with mental health conditions, as well as maybe ADHD, there's a lot of different reasons that accommodation exists, but it can be challenging. And I think the one thing that's different from high school to college is that you don't have your parents kind of telling you and, kind of guiding you of like, just reminding you of the steps that you need to do.
And that's why self-advocacy is so important, in public schools, especially for Black and brown kids. They aren't encouraged. They aren't taught to embrace it and wear it as a badge of honor, right? And I talk about this a lot. I taught in the public school system here, mostly Black and brown children, and nobody wanted to admit they had an IEP except for when it was time to get a job. And then when I worked in the more affluent, predominantly white institution over the summer, those high school kids were raising their hands. They were telling me that they took their medication, like they were accessing resources. And the program that I was teaching in, we took them on college tours every Friday to say, okay, this is how you would, this is the office you would request accommodations. These are the type of accommodations.
Right.
And Black students don't do that. I have parents reach out to me. Oh, my child is struggling. He can't pass this math class. And I'm like, well, did he have an IEP in K-12? Oh, yeah, but we're not going to use that. I'm like, no, that's not how it works.
Right.
And
the thing is, the exact same thing. And, another layer to that is, we're a beautiful and colorful diaspora, but some of us come from different countries. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act, special education didn't exist overseas. And then also for us as Black Americans, though, for us, Black and brown, we just don't seek out. I mean, we're a prideful culture. We have not, and we've been taught to distrust certain services. And there is some truth about the labels and like, how it can follow you. And, there is not always the best experience. So sometimes it's, been, in some experiences, they've just been like, no, I don't, I don't want to disclose. But the great thing now is that the focus in special education is inclusion. So it's not about, there might be certain things that your child might need to be separate to do and manage and things like that, like maybe speech therapy or, depending on what other services are offered. But most of the class are immersed with all the students.
And
so it's preparing them, to be like, depending on where they go.
Yeah. Navigate. And see, in K-12, you have the IEP. Okay. But once you leave high school, nobody's gonna know.
You have to self-disclose.
You have to self-disclose. And it makes me think back to when I was in graduate school, right? Let me tell you, and it was a predominantly white institution, PWI. I'll never, ever forget this. It was, I want to say it was my training and development course, because I really liked that teacher. I did my master's in HR, and I was doing a presentation, and I had two other people in my group. They were white. And I was planning a vacation trip. I think I was going to Vegas, actually. Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah. So I was going to Vegas, and we were working on this project, and we had to do a presentation. So as a group, we assigned each other a section. Do you know, at the last hour, I never forget, he's my friend on LinkedIn. He was like, oh, I can't write that. I have a learning disability. And, I don't even remember what he told me he had, but he couldn't do it. Then she popped up and said the same thing, right? That she had a learning disability and she couldn't write. I'm like, I'm about to board the plane. Oh my gosh, and this assignment is due. So I had to do the whole assignment, right? And I'm like, are you kidding me? And, of course, Logan wasn't born yet. I wasn't immersed in this environment, but I did do my internship in undergrad at with Special Olympics North Carolina. So I wasn't totally clueless but I thought, why did they wait till the last minute? But I'm even thinking, did my professor do that intentionally? Right? Because I'm thinking, like, how I get in that group with two of them that told me that, but they were white, they disclosed, right? They were in the program, they were thriving. I ended up writing the whole report. And the only thing that pissed me off was I could tell when we presented that they did not read it. Because you still had to do your section. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I could tell. And I'm looking like, and I never said anything to the professor because at the time I didn't know that in higher ed, you had to self-disclose, and she may have known, you know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't want to tell their business. But Allison, tell us about workplace accommodations, because what I see is, especially for Black and brown folks, they're not getting identified in K-12, or they are identified, but they're incorrectly identified. And if they are identified, they have an IEP, but it's not robust. They're not getting what they need. Right. They go to college. A lot of folks that I've spoken with, they were identified in college, right? They were able to cope and use some strategies in K-12. They identify in college, but then when they get in the workplace, they still don't know how to self-advocate, right? And in the workplace, a lot of folks just are not going to tell an employer that they need some assistance. No. I just start marking on every application, do you have a learning disability? A disability. It don't say learning. It says disability. And it lists all these things.
That's the EEO question.
Yep. And I mark yes now, right? Because I'm ADHD, and I'm like, I've got to figure out what I might need. Because right now, although I know I'm ADHD, I know how it shows up.
Right.
I still don't know what I might need at work. Right. And so I mark yes, because I say, you know what? If I'm advocating and I'm instructing others to do it, I'm going to practice what I preach.
Right.
And I mark yes. And so I remember having a ball chair at work. At the time, I didn't even know I was ADHD, but I think about how much it helped me. I sat on that exercise ball type of chair.
Right.
It helped me because I fidget a lot.
Right.
But that's when I'm thinking, right? I'm focused.
Right.
I don't even know. I'm still learning like what might help me or what I need, because I don't quite know what to ask for. Right. But I know sometimes I can feel overwhelmed with a lot of tasks. I work good with a lot of tasks, but I don't even know what to ask for to help me organize all those tasks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The workplace is very different. see, the thing is that depending on, what your disability is. So if we're talking about ADHD, dyslexia, etc., a lot of times you need academic accommodations and they don't translate in the workplace because, the workplace is a completely different environment. So there's a combination of ways that, like, there might not be a specific accommodation that you're requesting, but there's things that you need to compensate for. So for instance, sometimes it's like finding first, because the thing is, you have to be, the thing is under the ADA, it's about reasonable accommodations. Is also, there's a caveat about you have to be eligible for the workplace or the program. So you have to meet the needs of the job description with or without accommodations. So for instance, bring an exercise ball in, you can do that on your own, or your space might already be set up ergonomically that, they incorporate certain things like that. So for instance, Google, I think we all heard about, Google supposedly had the Rockstar workspaces. Like, they offered a cafe, they offered like these different sitting rooms. You don't have necessarily, some people might have an office space, but it's not the traditional office space, like they're shared spaces. Sometimes they're open spaces, open conference rooms. Just different ways for people to engage, take breaks, different work schedules. Like, it's not like a rigid 9 to 5, like you can come in if you work best from 6 to 3, or if you work best from like 7 to, 11 or something like that. Or excuse me, 7 to like, like 1 a.m. or something like that. Like, they offer a lot of that with their spaces because of the way their approach is very innovative, and they know like there's certain types of fields that a lot of individuals with disabilities thrive in.
Yes.
So, it's also about finding that match for you. So sometimes the reason why you don't necessarily know what to ask for is just because there's some things that you need to just do to self-compensate. So for instance, me with the calendar, with the way that my job is and what I have to manage, and I'm always being pulled in different directions, and I have to maintain my email, I have to do projects, I have to do meetings, I have, everything is on the go. And so like, for instance, like, I live by my calendar. So if it's not on my calendar, like, I have my personal calendar and work calendar, but I've been able to kind of manage that. And so I'm really good with organization and things like that. I used to do academic coaching and things, things of that nature. So I'm really good with organization and, time management and things like that, but I had to work at that. So, some of it has to be like certain things that we're working towards and compensating for. But in the workplace, like a deadline, you might not be able to push that back, but you might be able to, like, the great example was the exercise ball. Either your employer could buy that for you, or you could just bring that.
Well, you know what?
Office.
With that, I was at a special education school.
Yeah.
So that chair was already there. They said, "Oh,
Exactly.
Well, do you want to use one or the other?" I was like, "Oh, I'll take the exercise ball chair." Now, I took it because I thought it was going to help me with my abs.
Right.
But then when I realized, like, when I'm giving tours and I'm learning about the school and everything, and one of the great things is we had different seating for the children, right? And I'm like,
it's called ergonomic equipment.
Yes. And I said, wait a minute. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm sitting on this ball chair. And then hence I learned that I'm ADHD, and I'm like, wait a minute. And I remember rocking and not even knowing that I'm rocking on the chair. Right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is something. And I remember at another job, my supervisor, he had a standing desk.
Yeah.
You never saw him sitting down.
Yeah. And
he had like an extra mat on the floor.
Yeah.
And some type of equipment.
It's lumbar support.
Yes. So he has that.
And sometimes, that's the thing about the work environment and the match. Because one of the things that I always really focus on is like the way that we can build in accessibility is called universal design. So we're making those decisions ahead of time. So if we have a workspace, like, how are we making decisions about the type of furniture that we buy? You know what I mean? Because like the buying a standing desk and like some of those regular traditional, heavy desk and things like that. I know it's changing that we get lighter equipment now, but getting the standing desk serves all, because even you still can sit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like if people would prefer to sit, that's available to them. If you had circulation issues, that's a good fit for you. If you're just like, a health nut, that helps you, keep focus. Sometimes it helps with like, just the brain activity. And like some people have like treadmills, underneath their, doing their work. I saw that a lot in the pandemic. But yeah, if we build in ergonomics, that's a very inclusive approach for workplaces that minimizes the number of accommodation requests that are needed. So that's the strategy because the thing is, the standing desk and like that traditional desk are pretty much about the same price if you buy it ahead of time. So make those decisions ahead of time for this incoming, we're intergenerational at this point. So we need to think about all for a lot of different reasons, including, things that will serve, our disability communities, things that serve us in a neurodiverse, capacity, and thinking about the way that we process and think and come up with innovative types of, whether it's decision making, whether it's a specific project, whether it's a program, just the way that we engage and do that. Like, we're thinking about talent in a different way and accepting all these differences in ways that we haven't. That's what we should be working towards with inclusion.
Yeah. And you hit on a key thing. It doesn't cost much. It doesn't cost more.
If you do it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Do it from the beginning.
I think a lot of businesses, the first thing they think is cost.
Yeah.
And depending on how the business is structured, is it going to come out of my budget?
Right.
And they're thinking cost. And I know ADA compliance falls under HR. And, historically, HR hasn't been a money generating department. Right. It's been very transactional. And we know that good HR departments, they show you the numbers, right? They show you what it costs to recruit. They show you what it costs, how much money we lose if we don't have strong retention numbers, like how much it costs to backfill a position, and so we've got to be, as HR professionals, more savvy with saying, look at the cost of this if we do this now.
Absolutely.
Right. And they've got to speak the language of the CFO. You got to talk money to them.
You do.
To get their attention, to say, hey, we can do a better job.
Yeah. It's a great business practice.
Yeah.
It's the best business practice. And I think the beautiful thing of the pandemic and this shift of how we're thinking about work is that, for instance, schedule can, create barriers for some individuals with disabilities and what they're managing. So like, for instance, some people just naturally, how like back in the day when we had to figure out like our optimal concentration time, like some of us work better 9 a.m. and some of us are better later in the day. So, if we're thinking about how that exists in the workspace, why does 9 to 5 have to be like why is that the tradition? Now we can kind of think about hybrid ways of engaging in the workspaces. Now we can think about more teleworking opportunities and ways, to be productive at home. And that is, a way of thinking about inclusion. That's the beauty now too I'm glad you put it out there because, as I said earlier, some of it is we have to find the best fit for us. So like, for instance, an accommodation isn't going to solve everything. So you can't go into a job. Nobody can go into a job thinking the accommodation is going to get you the schedule you want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sometimes it can, but it depends on what's built in, already. And so you kind of are working around that and you're negotiating that. So, there's a lot of things that go into determining what's reasonable, a reasonable workplace accommodation. But for instance, the big thing now is with people returning to work, there is an uptick of people requesting, remote work as an accommodation, which, is valid and can be substantiated. The challenge is that not everybody's going to be approved. So it really depends on the work environment. So for instance, if you are working in an environment that requires a lot more social interaction, like if you're required to work directly with students, if you are working with patient care directly with patients, you're not going to be going to be approved for that, even if you request it. Even if you have a substantial valid reason, you're not going to be approved for that because of the work environment that you're in. And sometimes that can be there's some, it just depends on the corporation, institution, how their makeup, how large they are. Sometimes you might just have to look for another position, or sometimes they might have some options to like for a reassignment or certain things like that, but it's just not guaranteed. It just depends on how large the corporation so some of it is about the best fit for you. So like, then there's like another, let's say it's an IT role and you don't have to interface. Everything can be remote. So if you're asking for a remote in that setting, you could probably it'll be honored.
I'm
as an accommodation
that this pandemic will force some employers to step up their game with their technology. Because, for example, when I was working before the pandemic, we were all sent home. The governor shut Maryland down within the second, I think, or third week of March. And within a week of us sending everybody home to work remotely, we had issues. We all couldn't get on the server. Right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're not even equipped to have us working from home. Yeah. And then I talked to another friend of mine, and he's like, no, he worked for a larger institution. And he was like, no, we were doing those checks annually and sometimes quarterly to make sure. So when they made the shift to remote working, it was seamless. But now I'm like, wait a minute, they couldn't even support us all working, from home. And so I'm hoping that this will, have employers really looking at the technology and saying, you know what, let's up our game now, because these are questions, because I know I've been interviewing and I asked, so what is the COVID protocol? Right. If you have been around someone who has, been exposed to COVID and you go home for 10 days, what do you do? Right. Like, what do you do? Because if you're new, you don't have sick time acquired. Right. You cannot, you have to work for a year before you can get FMLA. Yeah. Right. So what are we doing? Right. In between. You know what I mean? Because previously, I remember years ago, it didn't matter, right? You weren't gonna, let's say for like a call center, and you
the call centers are the worst. Like, don't work there if you're not. There's gonna be they're the worst. Yeah, because they're designed for you to be a robot, and humans are not robots.
Yes, but now it's like even jobs like that. What are you gonna do? Right, like you can't. I mean, it's gonna cost you a ton of money to keep letting people go and then rehiring. Right. But I'm hoping that the upside of the pandemic is that with what we need and the questions and the situations that are going to occur that are beyond your control, right? That's going to impact everybody, every industry. Someone is exposed to COVID. The CDC protocol is the 10-day quarantine. Right. So I'm hoping that the blessing in all of this is that not only will it help those with learning disabilities, but they will implement this, like, as you said, this universal design so that it's helping everyone. And then folks who have learning differences, it's helping them as well.
And that's the thing too, when people are looking at future jobs and things like that, they should ask, what was the response? How did you support your workforce during the pandemic? That's a great question to ask nowadays.
I did. I asked that question, and
a great question.
Being a career coach and that being my background and my love, I'm always that interview is definitely always a two-way street with me. I'm revealing information that I did not before. And I'm asking those questions, and I'm like, red flag here.
Exactly. And you don't set yourself up for misery.
Yes. Oh my gosh, this has been awesome. Oh my gosh, we talked about so much, and you dropped so many gems. We talked about higher education accommodations. We talked about workplace accommodations and accessibility. And I want to point out that term universal design. I do see it used a lot in higher education around the online learning platform. So I just want parents, I want you to, our show notes are going to be amazing from this episode, but I hope that you really heard us when we said that students aren't requesting what they need in college. And especially for our Black and brown students, they are not going to the office to seek out services and supports that they need. It's at an alarming
rate. And that
rate.
We're eligible for and have a right to.
Eligible and have a right to. Did you hear that? Eligible and have a right to. And then in the workplace, it's different, but it's available, right? And these are conversations that we need to start having so that employers can do better. We're educating employers and we're educating ourselves, but the pandemic has opened up a wonderful opportunity for businesses to do better, right? And some laws you need to be familiar with are ADA and 504, Rehabilitation Act. So thank you, Allison. Thank you so much. This has been a ton of information.
Tune in next week, where we'll continue to bring you lived experiences and more unfiltered conversations with experts in the field around all things Black and Dyslexic. Make sure you subscribe and follow the Black and Dyslexic podcast, where we educate, empower, and equip Black and underrepresented minorities. The Black and Dyslexic podcast is partially funded by Morgan Cares and the Center for Urban Health Disparities Research and Innovation, awarded by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. The Black and Dyslexic podcast is sponsored by Dyslexia Advocation Incorporated, a 501c3 charitable organization located in Baltimore City, Maryland, whose mission is to equip parents of children with dyslexia and other language-based learning disabilities with the necessary tools to help their children become successful readers. You can find them on the web at www.soallcanread.org.